Thank you all for joining us for this important learning opportunity related to our work towards justice, equality, diversity, and inclusion within our organization and our sector. My name is Laura Wiebe, and I'm the Sustainability Specialist for the Manitoba Council for International Cooperation, and I'll be your host for today's session. I, again, just wanted to bring your attention to the chat box. There's a one-question survey. And I know that Rebecca is going to do a land acknowledgement as well, but I just wanted to mention that MCIC's office is based in, and that I'm joining the conversation from Winnipeg. This land is Treaty 1 territory and the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene people in the homeland of the Métis Nation. If you're unfamiliar with MCIC, the Manitoba Council for International Cooperation is a coalition of Manitoba-based organizations involved in international development. Our mission is to support, connect, and amplify the work of our members and partners while directly engaging and collaborating with Manitobans for global sustainability. MCIC develops and delivers tools, resources, and assistance designed to help Manitoba schools and educators contribute to international development, the Sustainable Development Goals, and fair trade. MCIC is also responsible for distributing Government of Manitoba funds designated for international development and humanitarian projects. MCI manages the Fair Trade Manitoba program and is a designated fair trade workplace. MCIC has officially signed on to the anti-racism framework for Canada's international cooperation sector. We recognize this not as an achievement, but as a springboard and commitment to our future anti-racism efforts. Our vision, a just world, can only be realized if systemic racism that exists everywhere is eliminated. Within our sector, this requires active work to dismantle systems that perpetuate racial bias, and for international aid to work to empower and enable agency and self-determination. Today, we've gathered for an educational session titled Truth and Reconciliation, Anti-Racism and Internationalization. We've invited Rebecca Chartrand, Vice President of Indspire, as our speaker. Indspire is a national Indigenous registered charity that invests in the education of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people for the long-term benefit of these individuals, their families, communities, and for Canada. Rebecca is a member of Pine Creek First Nation and the Vice President, Programs and Student Success at Indspire. Rebecca is Anishinaabe, Innu, and Métis with ancestral roots that run deep within the geography of the land where the Red and the Assiniboine rivers meet. She's an exceptional purpose-driven leader, thoughtful and thorough with a strong sense of pride and identity. She has a proven track record of leadership, public service, strategic planning, implementation, bridge building, and results. In her previous role as Division Principal of Seven Oaks School Division in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Rebecca developed Indigenous education policy and strategy, which, through careful implementation, has made Seven Oaks a leader of Indigenous education in Manitoba. She was also the driver behind a launch of a kindergarten to grade 3 Ojibwe bilingual school in 2017. Prior to that, Rebecca worked for a number of post-secondary institutes and K-12 school systems, both on and off reserve, advancing Indigenous achievement. Rebecca, thank you for joining us. I regret that we're not able to do this in person, but I'd like to virtually offer this tobacco, the sacred medicine. Would you be willing to share your knowledge with us over the next hour about truth and reconciliation, anti-racism, and internationalization?
Yes, absolutely. So thank you so much, Laura, for inviting me. I know we only have a few minutes together. An hour goes pretty quick, but thank you for that introduction, and thank you for the land acknowledgement, and thank you for the tobacco, and thank you for this opportunity just to share what I have come to understand about anti-racism and the work that we need to do in bridge building between all of our communities. So with that, I'll get started. I've accepted your tobacco. And yeah, so I just want to start by saying, that the place in which I'm located is Treaty Territory 1, which is the homeland of the Anishinaabe, the Innu, the Dakota, the Oji-Cree, and the homeland and birthplace of the Métis. But I also want to acknowledge that I work in Six Nations, or for Inspire, which is located in Six Nations, which is the homeland of the Haudenosaunee. And so I think that's very important as a premise to understanding why, land acknowledgements are important. So I'll be talking about that a little bit more in the presentation. But I also want to give a disclaimer that, the views, the thoughts, the opinions that are expressed in this presentation are mine, and solely mine, and not necessarily what is the position of Inspire. So some people may be, find the content offensive or off-putting or triggering. So I think it's important to just consider self-care, and to consider that, anti-racism, it does require having, courageous and sometimes uncomfortable conversations about things in order to move the needle forward. So, to give and to think about just making the affordances, that we may not always get it right, but, this is done with good intention. And it's also done with, building off of my lived experience and my understanding of where we're at with anti-racism. But I do want to point out that in Inspire's 7 guiding principles, principle number 7, there is the intent to look at, supporting Indigenous achievement through things like anti-racism and anti-oppressive pedagogies, as well as Indigenous pedagogy. So it definitely shows that this is an area of importance for Inspire as well. So the survey that we asked you to fill out is a 1-question survey. And I think, when we think about anti-racism, a lot of the work is really about understanding where we're at as we start to engage in this work. So we did ask people to fill out the survey to see, what's your starting point? Are you in a place of apprehension? Are you uncertain, of where to get started? Are you uncomfortable in using anti-racism language, to address, some of the issues of racism? Are you in a stage of aspiring, racism exists and you want to learn more? Do you feel ready, or do you feel prepared? And so prepared here would imply, that you've read some things around anti-racism. You might have some strategies that you'd like to use in your workplace, or even some ideas to contribute to today. So we did ask people to have a look at that. And I just wanted to quickly share the results of that in terms of where we're at collectively as a group as we get started with this conversation. So we have 16 people who said that they were ready, which is fantastic, because that's a good starting place to be. We have 1 person who's apprehensive, 2 people who are aspiring, and then 3 people that feel prepared to engage in this discussion, as well as to just contribute. Okay, so when we're talking about anti-racism, one of the things that I want to notice is that, we've really normalized suffering for some groups within, our Canadian culture. And, this has been a very dehumanizing experience for some people. When we look at the Black Lives Matter movement, it really brought about this era of racial reckoning that we're living in right now. And so everything that I've learned, everything that I've read, everything that I've experienced is really informing, what's in this presentation today. So I wanted to share with you that, racism has always existed within our spaces. But it's been that thing that we often haven't talked about, and for people of color, we've often, experienced microaggression in different forms, and I think it's always been our responsibility to harmonize with the situations that we live in and that we work in. And so sometimes we do have to step up and make those efforts to call, people out or call them into conversations to help them understand, where racism exists, where we see bias, where, we see, prejudice, or, or where we might see stereotypes in different spaces. So I think it's important to realize, we all have this lived experience. It's not just Indigenous people, but, people with difference have experienced all forms of racism. One of the things that I just wanted to point out is that, there is a whole array of terminology that's used within anti-racism, everything from looking at, how we frame it. A lot of people are using the term BIPOC, which represents Black, Indigenous, and people of color. I think it's really important to consider how we frame that, because it doesn't necessarily include everybody under that framework, especially when we think about, the Holocaust and anti-Semitism. Some of my discussions with some of my Jewish colleagues is that it doesn't represent them under that framework. And, that term originated in the States to really, center the Black experience in the US. And so when we think about framing it here in Canada, I've heard people refer to it as Indigenous, Black, and people of color. But it doesn't also address, the intersectionality. So, issues that the LGBTQ plus community experience, as well as people with disability. So I think it's important, again, to really think about how we're framing the conversation, and then to always frame it from our own centered experience. Some of the language that you often hear people talk about under anti-racism framework include things like, talking about white privilege, or else, the concept of whiteness and how people feel racialized or measured up against the standard of whiteness. So I think, again, the more informed you are around the literature, the better prepared we are to engage in these discussions. So here's an example of the books that I've read that are really informing my own thinking around anti-racism. So the book written by Ibram X. Kendi, How to Be an Anti-Racist. A lot of what he wrote is, I've used a lot of what he wrote to help frame out, this discussion here. The book written by Isabel Wilkerson Cass, an excellent book that really talks about the concept of whiteness and how it evolved over time. And then how, and then it also helps you understand, this caste system that we exist in, and really illuminates the contemporary tensions that we're seeing right now under this era of racial reckoning. The Skin We're In was written by Desmond Cole, so he's a Canadian. And I think it was really important to get a balanced perspective between what was written by American authors as well as Canadians. The lady in the middle here is Verna St. Denis. So she's kind of my go-to person in terms of looking at anti-racism discourse from an Indigenous lens. She's done a lot of on-the-ground projects. I was involved in one with her a number of years ago through the Manitoba Teachers Society. So she's helped frame some of this for me. And then in terms of her thinking and reflecting on some of the things that she's written as well. The book White Fragility is written by Robin DiAngelo. And so I think it's really important to have her perspective in this as well, because she is a white woman talking about the ways in which it's difficult to talk about racism with other white people. So for me, I tried to, create a really well-balanced and informed opinion about, my own thoughts about racism and anti-racism. And I think I also want to point out that, there is the book knowledge that informs, what we think and what we know about racism, but there's also that lived experience, and we can't discount that. We really have to value, what we've lived with and endured and experienced as people of color. One of the things that I also wanted to point out is that, this issue is very personal for me right now, because my own son, Chad, has really struggled with the color of his skin over the last year and a half. The image here on the left is, that was his portfolio that was the cover of his portfolio that he brought home last year. And this picture was on the inside. So this was the front cover. And the first thing my son said to me was like, "Mom, this is me. This is me, and I'm brown." He turns the page and says, "Mom, this is me when I was white and I started turning brown." So the dark circles represent when in his mind, he started turning brown. So that's when he was 6 years old. And so this has been it's been a very painful experience to see my son struggling with the color of his skin and the skin that he's in. And for somebody like me who's worked in under the umbrella of Indigenous education for the last, 15 years as a leader within that space, who's really promoting, the integration of Indigenous perspectives within, existing school systems, I work really hard to try and teach my kids to be proud of who they are as Anishinaabe and Inuit people. And, you know, and it's very disheartening that my son, you know, at the age of 6, his cumulative experience, you know, is telling him that there's something wrong with the color of his skin. And he's often expressed that, you know, he wishes he had white skin. He feels that, you know, he's unlucky with his brown skin. And, you know, there's been issues with him and, I guess just feeling that, you know, during this COVID period, you know, how kids aren't able to play with each other. You know, some of that might be playing into this as well, but, you know, I think we have a lot of work to do as a Canadian society to help all kids feel comfortable with the color of their skin. And, you know, kids are very receptive, they pick up on things. So, you know, that really prompted me to dig deeper and to really understand, you know, what my own lived experience was with this, but also to inform my thinking and to engage in discussions with colleagues about this. So that's one of the reasons that I really appreciate that I've been asked to contribute to this series on anti-racism. I've also just completed developing a framework, an anti-racism framework for the development of an anti-racism policy for one of our Winnipeg school divisions. So I've been engaged in lots of conversations around anti-racism and the work that we need to do. So one of the questions that I also asked is, you know, like when we think about anti-racism, you know, it can immediately get people's backs up because it's like you start using the word anti-racism and it's like you're implying that somebody's racist. And so, you know, those red flags go up. But I think it's important, you know, to hold the mirror up and to say, okay, you know, where does bias exist for me? You know, and how might I be acting out, you know, towards other people based on this bias? And it's not to say that, you know, racism is static. It's not to say that, you know, if you behave a certain way towards somebody that, you know, you're branded a racist forever. It just means at that time and in that situation, racism occurred, you know, and you might be racist towards one situation and not towards another. And so I think we have to understand it as, you know, the way in which it manifests through our own personal experience, but the way in which it also exists within, you know, our institutions. And so those are two separate things. And I'm hoping that, you know, through what I present today, that we might be able to have a better understanding of what that looks like. And so this was also put in the chat box. It was the first post, you know, and it's asking, you know, are you a racist or an anti-racist? And is there an in-between? Okay, so this is based on the book, How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi. So I thought it would be interesting just to go through that process, because here a racist is defined as somebody who sees others as different, you know, through stereotypes, prejudice, and may discriminate based on their beliefs of difference or inferiority. You know, it might be somebody who denies other people's ideas or their ideas or actions are racist. Somebody who doesn't really care if it happens to other people as long as it doesn't happen to them. So it's that apathy, right? That lack of care and concern. Not racist are people who don't see color. You know, so you might hear people say, well, I don't see color. I treat everybody the same. You know, I'm neutral. I just ignore it. You know, I might hear comments, but, you know, sometimes I'll respond, other times I'll carry on. And I just learned to appreciate all cultures. So an anti-racist is somebody that, you know, acknowledges that it exists, that stands up for people when they're being treated unfairly, you know, that are willing to hold up, you know, that mirror to themselves, to challenge their own thoughts, their feelings, their beliefs and actions. And, you know, people who are constantly working towards creating equity, inclusion, and safety for everybody. And then, of course, locates the roots of racism and power in politics. So I just want you to reflect on that for a second. Feel free to, you know, click on that link and to fill this in. All right, so now when we think about where we situate ourselves in that, Ibram X. Kendi in his book basically says there is no in between. You are either a racist or an anti-racism. And the idea that there is a space of neutrality, it really just contributes to the status quo, and the status quo is contributing to maintaining a racist society. And so anybody who would have considered themselves in the not racist stage then would therefore be contributing to maintaining the status quo. So Robin DiAngelo, who wrote the book White Fragility, she was on one of the previous slides I just showed. She basically looks at it in this way. She says, there's this dominant framework that's always running in our back as a backdrop when we start to talk about racism. And she says, it's the idea that you're either racist or you're not racist. And if people associate you with being a racist, then it's like you're bad. Right? And if you see yourself as not racist, then you're good. And so racism implies that there's a level of ignorance, that there's bigotry, prejudice, that you might be mean. And some people associate that with being old based on some of the research that she's done. And then the not racist idea is that you're progressive, you're educated, you're well-intentioned, you're open-minded, and you're young. And so, being less racist is not a fixed location based on, good intentions or self-image or past actions, and to say that I'm not racist, that allows people to avoid participating in racism. So it's a way of saying that it's not my problem. And, we realize that, failing to acknowledge racism allows, certain groups of people to benefit from these systems, that are biased or that are set up to benefit some groups over others. And so it's really important for us to think about where we situate ourselves and how we see ourselves within the context of anti-racism. And so, based on what I've read, Robin DiAngelo basically says, the starting point for anti-racism is not a question of whether racism exists, because it exists. So let's move on from that and start to question, whether, the question isn't, did racism take place, but how did it manifest in that situation, and also recognizing that as a society, we've been socialized to participate in racism, whether we like it or not. So nobody's good, nobody's bad. We just need to understand and deconstruct, these systems that we live in. And also recognizing that nobody's neutral in the situation, so to not act against racism supports racism. One of the things that she's pointed out in her book as well is that, is the idea that white people have benefited from institutional racism, regardless of their intentions or because intentions are irrelevant. And so I think it's really important, moving forward, to consider the ways in which we start to dismantle it and understand that, because these are the intentions, that's the elephant in the room that we're trying to dismantle in order to create equity and better outcomes for everybody. So, the other thing around this is that there isn't a monopoly on suffering, that everybody experiences this in some format in their lives. I want to point out, that there's been a lot of effort within the education system to address, racism and other issues of inequity. And so Kimberly Crenshaw is an anti-racism scholar who coined the term intersectionality. And she created this slide here on the left to show, how some of these things overlap, right? So sometimes people discriminate against each other based on gender or their sexuality, sometimes race, and sometimes there's a combination of things. And it's really important, again, to unpack that and understand what that means. And so I created the slide here on the right to show the ways in which we've created these different initiatives within the education system to address these injustices, because that really is the common denominator in it. So we could see that we've created, multicultural education, we have human rights education, we have social justice education, Aboriginal education. We've done a lot around diversity and inclusion. We've created safe space policies to address issues around experienced by the LGBTQ+ community. And now we're starting to look at things from an anti-racism lens. So when we look at the totality of it, I think it's important to recognize that a lot of these initiatives started with multicultural education in the 80s. I think things started to emerge like around the 70s and then the 80s. In Canada, there was a real push for multiculturalism, which was really focused on immigration, and bringing in, immigrants and skilled workers into Canada to diversify our economy, as well as to bring in, skilled laborers into areas where there was a need to do so. But this also had an effect on the education system. And so we started looking at concepts like multicultural education, which became more formalized in our systems. And so under that banner, Indigenous people basically said, you know what, we're not allowing ourselves to be included under that umbrella because we are the original people in Canada. We have distinct rights, we will get lost, or those issues and those rights will be overshadowed in with the multicultural umbrella. So that is where Aboriginal education emerged in part. Is in the 80s we started to see people looking at what are the things that need to be illuminated in terms of Indigenous people's unique experience in this country. And so that was the beginning of integrating Indigenous people's perspectives, their cultures, their histories into curriculum where it was sorely being omitted. We also see that, we moved from multicultural education to a lens of diversity and inclusion, because we basically said, multiculturalism isn't enough. It's not enough to recognize the diversity. It's not enough to celebrate, that diversity, but we need to see some real action around it. So that's when things moved to this diversity and inclusion lens. And so that's when you started to see HR policies, so employment equity policies, and intentional hiring to diversify things, but often things have deferred to gender equality. I think there have been intentional efforts to hire Indigenous peoples as well. But I think, we're at that stage now where we need to start looking at collecting data to see how far we've actually moved the needle. So when we think about diversity and inclusion training, this is where we've seen, cultural competency training emerge, social justice education, and human rights. Now we're at the stage of anti-racism education. And so it's really moving us to that next step. It's moving us to consider, how are we moving the needle? What's the evidence that tells us that we've actually had impact in these efforts? And so it's about truth and it's about equity. And people are saying that diversity and inclusion, it's not enough, because when you look at our large institutes, often there's, maybe one or two people or a small unit that's, basically created to address the issues of diversity and inclusion, for an entire organization. And so I think we need to look at, the ways in which we need to be transformative within, our the institutions that we work in, to see that we're actually having impact. So that's an important discussion. And I think that's exactly where we're at right now within this era of racial reckoning, is we're looking for better outcomes. And anti-racism is pushing us to look at the policies that maintain inequities, the daily practices, the procedures, the ways in which people address or don't address racism within, the spaces that we live and work in together. So when we think about the intersections then between internationalization, truth and reconciliation, or anti-racism, I put this together to help myself understand, okay, what are the common spaces then? What are the intersections? What are we trying to achieve? So I really appreciate again that Laura has asked me to talk about this subject, because a year and a half ago, I was invited to speak at the Canadian Bureau of International Education at their biannual conference. And so I was a part of a panel, and the panel was talking about, the problems with internationalization. Like, there were issues. So people were basically approaching it from the lens that there was a problem with it, that we weren't getting to where we needed to be with internationalization. And so I was the only Indigenous person on the panel, and my perspective was so different than everybody else that spoke prior to me. So here I am sitting on stage and I'm looking at the audience and just looking at all of the diversity there. So one of the things that I started to, I wasn't sure what I was going to speak about at that point. And so when I started talking, I said, like, when I have a much different perspective here, I said, look around the room, look at the diversity in this space, from an Indigenous lens. We've been very successful with internationalization simply by, the efforts that we've created to, to bring newcomers into this space. It was also interesting, in terms of the conversations that I was having at this conference, with so many people. And what I found was that, international students often used international education as a fast track to immigration. It was the way in which to speed up the process, at least here in Manitoba. It, you were able to jump through some of the loops, and it helped you gain access, to citizenship much quicker. But the three criteria that people were determining as, how do you define successful integration into Canada? Not what I often heard was like, a good education, securing employment, and then also building relationships with white people. And so when I started to reflect on that, and I spoke about this as part of my panel presentation, was that, as an Indigenous person, when I hear these things, there is no recognition of who we are as Indigenous peoples within these frameworks that people are operating in. And so I started talking about the treaties and saying, we have to recognize, that the treaties gave opportunity for settlers to move into our traditional territories and to share in the land and the resources. And that is ultimately what was, the common denominator in the treaties, was the idea of shared responsibility, mutual obligation to each other. And I think when we look at internationalization, it's the same thing. People are looking for, opportunities to live in, to work in, and to contribute to what is Canada. From our lens, Canada's Turtle Island, people want to be included, whether it's from an international lens or an anti-racism lens or from a lens of truth and reconciliation. People want to feel respected for their diversity and their difference. They want to feel valued. They want to belong. They want to benefit from opportunity, and they want to be safe. And so I think that is the common space. We all have the desire, for successful inclusion and for advantage, and the opportunity to take full advantage of the opportunities that exist. And when we look at the space between anti-racism and truth and reconciliation, it's issues around equity. It's about truth telling. It's recognizing, the marginalization that has existed, for Black people, for Indigenous people, for people of color, the injustices that exist for, the LGBTQ communities, or for, people of color, the oppression. But when we look at things from truth and reconciliation, there is an importance around self-determination, around sovereignty, around decolonizing and helping the rest of Canadians relearn or unlearn what they've learned in history, to understand the lived experience that we've endured, with cultural genocide, and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission just ended. And, we've collected stories from thousands of residential school survivors across the country. And, that was a long uphill battle for our people, was to get that recognition. So I think in moving forward, the common denominator in all of this is relationships. Is how do we create the space, for each other to exist? How do we create space so that we each acknowledge, the value of each other, and hold the space for each other as well to to share our stories, to illuminate the power and equities that we've experienced, to address racism, institutional racism, to understand how we're being socialized to live and work in this society we call Canada. One of the other things that I've learned through an internationalization lens is I have a lot of colleagues who immigrated here from other countries, and in the Canada schools where that help prepare them for immigration, they learned a lot of stereotypes and a result have come to Canada with prejudice towards Indigenous peoples. And so, I've had colleagues basically share that, they were told to stay away from Indigenous people, and not to worry, because Indigenous people are at the bottom of the economic ladder. So you're going to be fine as long as you work hard, stay away from Indigenous people, stay away from areas where they're concentrated. So here in Winnipeg, that would be like the North End, for example. But these are the conversations, the truth telling that needs to happen. And a result of engaging in this work, I've really appreciated my colleagues just stepping up and telling me, like, look, there's an issue here. As an immigrant, I was taught this, and I know that, some of my family and community really think this way, about your people. And I want to figure out a way how to challenge that. And so that's a good example of, the truth telling, illuminating the tensions that exist, but then also moving towards a lens of anti-racism in terms of what we need to do. So I think for me as an Indigenous person, it's really important that we dig down deep to understand like the affordances that, Indigenous people have made to accommodate, the inclusion of other peoples into our territories. Because when you think about diversity, inclusion, and equity, from our lens, diversity is a fact. Inclusion is a decision, meaning, our institutions, our organizations have to decide that they're going to make room for diversity, right? And equity, to us, equity is what was envisioned at the signing of the Canadian Indian treaties. So I think from an Indigenous lens, we've really practiced that culture of caring. When you look at our values, it's really about community well-being and not individual well-being. And so the values that were brought over in those early contacts were quite different. And even though we saw that there was mutual agreement or mutual benefit between Europeans and Indigenous people, there was bound to be conflict because the underlying values were so different. So again, with the treaties, it was about mutual benefit, mutual obligation. It was like, yes, there's room in the circle for you, because of the, because that is part of the value of Indigenous people. So, so diversity is a fact, inclusion is a decision, and equity is where there's a lot of work. So when we think about internationalization, excuse me. When we think about internationalization, Canadian race relations, and truth and reconciliation, I think it's important to recognize the calls to action as well that resulted from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So call to action number 57, it's urging the federal governments, all levels of governments, to provide education to the public and to public servants that includes, our histories, that really looks to create intercultural competency and that supports this from an anti-racism lens, which is why I'm really happy that we have the opportunity to explore what anti-racism is. And when you look at the diversity of Canada, I thought this was really interesting. This came out when we were celebrating Canada's 150th birthday. So in Canada, there's 1.4 million Indigenous peoples. So that's 4.3%. But then there's 7 million of people in Canada who are foreign born So that's approximately 22% of the total Canadian population. So again, when I think about internationalization, I think we're quite successful on that front. I think what we need to work from a very Indigenous-centered lens is the relationship between Indigenous peoples, between international students, between immigrants, between refugees, because the people that are coming in that are new to the country don't necessarily have the history or the understanding of the relationship between Indigenous people and newcomers that goes back, you know, since to the time of contact. So there might be less of an investment in learning that history, but what we do need to notice is that, you know, the prejudice that people are learning in these Canada schools that help prepare them for immigration, and the work that we need to do within our educational institutions to address these issues. One of the other calls to action, 93 and 94, is looking to change the citizenship oath. So basically, before anybody is given Canadian citizenship, they have to take an oath. And so there have been amendments to that. I'm not sure if they've actually gone through, but they were approved by the federal government. So the oath would basically say, you know, I swear or affirm that I will be faithful and bear true allegiance to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth. I will faithfully observe the laws of Canada, including the Constitution, which recognizes and affirms the Aboriginal and treaty rights of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples, and fulfill my duties as a Canadian citizen. So this is a step in the right direction, because I think it's inserting opportunities to help bring awareness and education and improve relationships between Indigenous people and newcomers. So again, diversity is our reality. Inclusion is a decision, is hard work. And I think that's why an anti-racism lens is really important, because we have to have evidence-based outcomes that tell us, are we moving the needle along? And if not, what do we need to do within our organizations to move things along? Because we know that, you know, multiculturalism, diversity, and inclusion efforts within institutions, you know, they really fell off the radar in around, you know, the early 2000s, because I think people felt, well, okay, we have an employment equity policy, we've hired some people, we've diversified, we've hired more women, we've hired some people, we've hired a diversity and inclusion specialist, check, you know, so people are checking off the box and saying, okay, we're done. You know, but the work doesn't really end there. You know, we have to speak from and look at our own lived experience, you know, and understand, you know, where we might have, you know, caused pain or harm or inequity, or how we maintain equity in these systems, you know, through the bureaucracies, through the policies that exist that maintain the status quo. You know, how do we diversify not only at the, you know, at the entry level positions, but how do we diversify at the leadership level? Because we know that that's where real change happens. And so I think, you know, just to wrap things up, I only have a few more slides. You know, we have to ask ourselves, who am I? Self-assess using an anti-racism framework. How have I been racialized? How do people look at me? You know, do they see me as a person of color? You know, how do I racialize others? What do I think, you know, when I think about other people from other races or ethnicities? You know, how do I self-identify? Where do I hold power and privilege? How does my history and my class impact my lived experience? Where do I experience disadvantage? Where do I notice this for other people? How do I witness inequity and injustice? Where do my ancestral roots originate? It's important to know who you are, right? What is my relationship to the original peoples of this land and to people of color? You know, what is my story, my family story, and where does this intersect? So I think that's where positionality is an important part of anti-racism. It's making apparent and declaring who you are, what your settler background is, you know, whether you see yourself as an ally, how you're racialized, how you understand racism. And so I wanted to bring some attention to land acknowledgements. I think land acknowledgement from an Indigenous lens is an important part of this process, because it recognizes Indigenous people as the original people of this country, but it also recognizes the treaties. So the treaties are very important in understanding the opportunities that were created for non-Indigenous peoples to move into our territories. And not every part of this country has a treaty. Those things are still being renegotiated or negotiated because Canada is such a young country. So we have to think about, I don't know if you've heard concepts like we are all treaty people, but it means that, sure, I have a treaty card. I may have a treaty card, but as a Canadian person, by default, you are a treaty person. Because what that means is that you've been able to, purchase land, you've been able to work in, secure a job, grow your family on these lands because of the agreements that we engaged in. And there's still huge tensions around the treaties because from our understanding, it was about sharing land. It was about mutual benefit and mutual obligation to each other in moving forward to create, a society that would be mutually beneficial to us. So, but what we've seen instead is that, through colonial violence and these colonial legacies, Indigenous people, are the poorest of the poor, overrepresented in all the socioeconomic ills within this country. So when we say we are all treaty people, it's important to recognize as a Canadian how you've been able to benefit from the treaties that you would not have been able to move into our territories, if we did not sign these agreements. So positionality and land acknowledgements. So when we do land acknowledgements, I acknowledge that, right now I'm in Treaty Territory 1. It's the homeland of the Anishinaabe and some of these other groups I message. But it's also understanding like who are we under an anti-racism framework and the intersectionality that's happening. So there's been a lot of work done around LGBT plus. So who am I in terms of my pronoun, right? She and her. So that's how I acknowledge myself. But also to recognize that, I'm a person of color. I've experienced disadvantage and marginalization. I also recognize that I'm a bridge builder, and there are places in my life where I hold power and privilege, such as the role that I'm in now as the Vice President of Inspire under Programs and Student Success. And so I think, it's important just moving forward. If you see yourself as an ally, how are you demonstrating that? Marilyn Monroe did that by supporting Ella Fitzgerald. She wouldn't go into a club unless they were allowing Ella Fitzgerald, a Black singer, to sing. So, how do you use your power and privilege to empower other people who are disadvantaged? And then, of course, looking at our education as a social system, understanding, that this really promotes a certain perspective. It promotes benefits for certain people when we're omitting certain things. The stories we teach, what we teach, how we teach, who's teaching us. It really impacts on how we come to see ourselves and how we exist within these social systems. So I think as educators, we have a lot of work to do in disrupting these systems, challenging it, looking at ways to diversify, which starts with us. So you will get this PowerPoint and you'll be able to see what some of the other thinking was around this. So I think I'm going to leave it at that because I do want to give some people, answer a couple of questions. So I'll pass it over to Laura.
Thank you so much for your thoughts, Rebecca. I know I personally have a few questions that I would love to be able to ask. However, I'm more than happy to share the questions raised by the audience. So if you do have any questions, please go ahead and put your questions in the Q&A box, or you can put your hand up. So I do see already one question in that box, and there was a hand. So we'll go through, and when you have a question, please go ahead and raise your hand and we'll get through them. So the first question that's here for you, Rebecca, is what role can and should education play?
Okay, good question. So I think when we look at the education system, I think first of all, we have to realize that when we're trained to become teachers, we're not trained to challenge or question the way in which we're being trained. And so this is how somebody had framed it. So it's very technocratic, right? It's like, how do you teach curriculum? So when you're trained as a teacher, it's like you're being taught to go in and learn how to use the library. When you get your master's in education, it's you start reading the library and questioning it and critiquing it. And then when you get your PhD, you start contributing to the library, meaning you start to inform thinking. So I think that process has to happen much quicker. We need to start thinking critically about the ways in what we teach, the stories we tell, you know, the ways in which we understand disadvantage, the barriers that exist for our students. From an Indigenous lens, we're always wanting to look at students holistically to understand that, you know, it's not an equal playing field for all students, and equity doesn't mean that we treat everybody the same, right? Because if you say, when I hear people say, you know, I don't see color, then, you know, in my head, it's like, okay, well, then you don't see me. You don't see my son. You don't see the challenges, the unique challenges that he's experiencing. So I think we have to look at the education system from that lens, and start to look at ways to integrate, you know, diverse perspectives, and to even diversify, like, you know, our staff complement, to look at our attitudes, the beliefs that we hold, the policies that we have in place that maintain the status quo. And then there was just some, you know, some suggestions that I gave here.
Thank you for that. I'm not sure. I just wanted to mention that we did post that second link that you had posted to the second self-reflection question about am I a racist or an anti-racist, or there was a third category as well. That had been posted in the chat box. So I'm not sure if you were planning to share the results of that,
Sure.
that as well. That would be wonderful.
Okay, I will, yeah, I'll pull it up. In the meantime, were there any other questions?
So no other questions have come in yet, but like I mentioned, I do have a few that I'd like to ask you. But one thing you had mentioned when we were having an initial discussion was that there's opportunities to potentially get involved with mentorship with Indigenous youth through Inspire. Is that something that you could talk about in order to, I mean, personally, I feel like it's quite important to learn about a culture, to be able to act appropriately, and what's your perspective on that, and what are the opportunities through Inspire?
Okay, great. Yeah. So we do have the Rivers to Success program, and you could look at that information online. So we have Indigenous students who are looking for mentors in 3 streams, in a high school stream, post-secondary stream, and then transition to employment stream. So basically, students sign up online. Indigenous students sign up online. They, you know, declare their interest, where they'd like to grow into in terms of their career sector or their post-secondary education. And so the mentors sign up online as well, identifying that they're a mentor, they're interested in mentorship. So the program itself is called Mentor City. And so it's basically an online algorithm that helps match people up with each other. So, you know, if we have students that are looking at international education, for example, or working for a nonprofit, and they identify that, and if somebody from their staff was there, it would naturally line them up. But we also have staff that are dedicated to supporting these relationships and supporting Indigenous students on that journey as they transition through the 3 stages. So I encourage you to have a look online. So if you just type in Rivers to Success and Inspire, this information will come up. Here's the 3 streams: high school, post-secondary, and career transition. And again, we know that there's an underrepresentation of Indigenous people, within post-secondary and within the various industry sectors. So it's important, for us that we create these opportunities to walk beside Indigenous students as they're transitioning through the stages. So to become a mentor, you would, basically click on the site here, and then you would sign up here, and then you'd identify, what stream you'd like to support, high school, post-secondary, or the career transition. But we do have a manager who oversees it. So that's Ruth Norton. The pilot of this program started last year, so they've had one complete run through. But the work that they're doing is fantastic. We have such a dedicated team that's creating resources, events, and that are bringing students together either one-on-one with their mentor, or we're now looking at cohorts. So it's continuing to grow.
Great. And I think you were going to share the results. You had that pulled up before I asked you another question about the mentorship. So I'll let you go ahead and do that.
So here's the results. It shows that 9 people feel that they're in the anti-racism stage. 1 is not racist, and then 1, so there was none, which is great. So this shows me that, people are really dedicated to this work, preaching to the choir. I hope people found, what I presented as food for thought. It's one perspective. It's naturally going to be very Indigenous centric, simply because I am an Indigenous woman. I think if we were hearing a presentation from somebody, with a different background, that you would naturally just hear the things that are important to them, or the things that inform their thinking. So I want to thank people for, and you, Laura, and for giving me the opportunity to speak today, because again, I think we have to start having these conversations, and sometimes it is going to create discomfort, but we need to be courageous in having those conversations, because, children like my son really depend on us, to find ways to change the system, so that he feels comfortable in his skin, and so that he sees himself as having opportunity at success. Because in my conversation, he also associates being brown with, being unlucky. But he also expressed at one time that he also saw it as, brown people are always failing, And so he's so receptive and articulate and expresses his emotions really well. So, I'm just grateful that I have a lot of good people that I can talk through these things with. But, from the perspective of a mom, it's still very painful, because you want the best for your child, and you want them to feel good about themselves. And, so there's still a lot of work that we have to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And we still have a couple more minutes left until the end of the presentation, and I do have 3 more questions. So are you available to answer a few more?
Yeah, absolutely.
So the first question is, can you recommend some techniques for debriefing and recognizing internal sensitivities after this type of conversation respectfully? So if, for example, the organization was to give an educational presentation and someone in the classroom was affected or impacted by the content of the presentation, what could you recommend that presenter could be able to do?
Yeah, well, I think it's important just to see like the resources that you have in-house, like designating people to reach out to after this. So if there's anybody that, does want to reach out to me as a result of this, to have further conversation because it may have triggered or has, caused a pain point, absolutely, like I am available. But I think it's also the responsibility of an organization to also consider those things. What are the resources? How do we talk about it? How do we, if somebody's wanting to disclose something, I think that's where the work begins, right? If somebody wants to say, hey, I heard this presentation and I want to point out that, I've been experiencing microaggression here on a day-to-day basis for this amount of time, and I think I'm ready to start talking about that. Then I think, like if you are going to have these kinds of presentations, you have to also be willing to put the time and the resource behind it. And so when we talk about holding up a lens individually, we have to hold up a lens within the institutions that we work in, like how diversified are we? How do we support, our staff in these ways? Do we have policy? Safe and inclusive policy? Do we have equity hiring practices? How do we support? And we know we do have policies around, safety and harassment and discrimination in the workplace, but, how do we really process those things? Is there, are there steps that we take, or do we just kind of figure it out on an ad hoc basis? So, so that really requires every institution, organization to again, to have a look, to look at yourselves and create the supports and the resources for staff so that they do feel safe when they need to come forward and have these difficult conversations.
That's great advice. So we have two more questions. It's 11 o'clock, so there may be a few people signing off, but we still do have a large number of participants on the call and two more questions. So the next question is, there's a huge need for continuing education once you leave the school system about anti-racism work, truth and reconciliation, and among others. How can organizations approach continuing ed to support their employees' learning and positive dialogue?
Mm-hmm. I think it comes back again to like the commitments of an organization. So where do those commitments become evident? They become evident in strategic priorities, right? Through the leadership. And so looking at, where do commitments exist within the organization? Are there dedicated positions to addressing this work, to diversifying? Do we see it in the policies that exist within the organization? And if no policies exist, then then maybe it's time to start looking at creating some. And so if you work in a unionized environment, there's certain ways of bringing that forward. There's processes. If you work in a non-unionized environment, again, you have to figure out what are the ways in which, people bring important issues to the table or priorities. It's through strategic planning. It's through discussions at team meetings. It's finding a way to get that, that priority, to the top so that the leadership can see it as a priority. So I think it's really understanding your systems, taking a look at it, seeing whether it exists or not as a priority, and finding a way to strategize to bring that forward as a priority.
The last question in the chat box here is, can you talk about some of the challenges facing Indigenous students that Inspire works with? I'm asking to understand as a white person that doesn't face challenges related to race.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think when you look at the work of Inspire, we've really been growing our research arm to understand where some of those challenges exist. So if you look at our website, you could find some of the data there that helps you identify what the challenges are. So what you'll notice are some common and ongoing themes of like, when we're looking at it from an educational lens, Indigenous students often feel stereotyped, and sometimes that comes out in the literature that people are reading that are assigned to them, the ways in which, instructors might be speaking about Indigenous people that is ill-informed or that really illuminate stereotypes coming through, or even prejudice. So those are experiences that are ongoing for Indigenous students. I think also looking at the disparities, the fact that the majority of children experiencing poverty in this country are Indigenous children. Some of the access to post-secondary education. So with poverty, come limitations for opportunity. So that's why Inspire exists, is, without the support that we provide in the form of scholarships and bursaries, a lot of Indigenous students would not be able to attend post-secondary education. So I think just learning as much as you can about the original people of Canada so that you're informed of the impacts of colonization, of the recommendations outlined in the Truth and Reconciliation, and why we continue to see, this disparities between Indigenous people and the rest of Canadians. And I don't think you can really understand it until you start digging into the history and understanding the ways in which colonization has worked, and how, these institutions weren't set up for Indigenous people to thrive in. That's why residential schools were created. That's why reserve systems were created. The reserves, the First Nation communities were basically created to keep Indigenous First Nations people out of mind and out of sight while the rest of Canada was developing. And it's still a very young country. And so at the root of it is racism, right? So I think we need to acknowledge that, and we need to understand that it's not a thing of the past. It still exists amongst us. And that's a lot of the contemporary unresolved tensions that we continue to work in, and we need to work through.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. Just to kind of end things off, I guess on a personal note, my background is in sustainable tourism, and an issue that we talk about a lot is cultural appropriation versus respectful practice of all cultures. So maybe as a final question, do you have any thoughts on respectful practice versus cultural appropriation of making sure we're doing land acknowledgements correctly, following the process of inviting someone to speak? Any final thoughts on that?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, I think it's important when we think about tourism that we recognize that Indigenous people existed all across Turtle Island. So you're on the traditional territory of some Indigenous group. And so land acknowledgements are important, but land acknowledgement can't be just lip service. It really needs to, your land acknowledgement really needs to understand, who are the original people in which, I live and work. My house is, where am I located? So I think orienting yourself to that is taking in that understanding, being able to acknowledge Indigenous people in their own, the ways in which they self-identify. So it's not good enough anymore to just use the word like Aboriginal and Indigenous when we're doing land acknowledgements, but recognizing the diversity that exists amongst us, and the way in which people pronounce their own language, Anishinaabe, Innu, Haudenosaunee, come to understand that. And then I think understand, the harms that have been done to Indigenous people and what we're doing to rectify that. And, from a reconciliation lens, it's always about relationships. How do we ensure that we're building and maintaining good relationships with Indigenous people? And what is my role in addressing, some of the wrongs to Indigenous people? So making sure that we're not exploiting, Indigenous peoples in the many forms that we can, so when we think about tourism, sometimes we think about, the things that people could take as takeaways as their visit to certain areas. So, if you're selling Indigenous goods or things that represent Indigenous people, to ensure that they're included, to include the elders in our leadership when we're looking at, promoting tourism in certain areas. And I think Indigenous people need to be a part of all of these conversations. We need to have a seat at the table. This is our traditional homeland. This is where we originate. So when we think about things like immigration or even tourism, we should have a say, in what we hope to bring into our territories. So I think engaging and building those relationships, informing yourself by learning the history is the first best step. And then ensuring that you're working with and alongside Indigenous people. And because it comes back to that saying, nothing about us without us, right? So we need to be included.
Thank you so much for that Rebecca. That's very powerful, and we're getting some great comments in the chat box about how much this presentation was appreciated, and people are looking forward to sharing this with their workplaces more broadly. And so we thank you so much for your time today, and I'd like to connect with you afterwards to put the tobacco in your hand, and also a small gift from MCIC. So thank you to everybody for joining us today. Apologies, we went a few minutes over. Thank you so much, and have a great day, everyone.
Yeah, so Laura, can you stay on for a minute?
Yeah, I'll do that.
Okay, great. Thank you, everybody.
And,
have a wonderful day.
And so we'll just wait for our participants to leave here.
Okay.